This is a video about Chapter 35, which discusses the struggle for independence of Asian and African countries. The Battle of Algiers, a controversial film, directed by Gilo Pontecorvo, describes that era in history. It is a moving film that reflects the struggle for independence in Africa, namely Algeria. In the film, the National Liberation Front prevails against the colonial government and gains independence. We will now show you a clip from the trailer of the film.
Nous sommes arrivés à la moyenne de 4,2 attentats par jour. Oui, il faut distinguer les attaques individuelles et les attentats à la bombe. Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur et la violence. Nous devons agir sur cette minorité dans le but de l'isoler et de la détruire.
With a common European enemy gone, the deep divisions between the different ethnic and religious groups that had been thrown together in the post-colonial states became more and more apparent, disruptive, and destructive. These related challenges, which were faced by all the newly independent peoples of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, were reflected worldwide. The leaders of the new nations found their efforts to spur economic growth limited by concessions made to the departing colonizers and by the nature of the international economy. The economy was weak, and it heavily favored industrialized nations. They saw their ambitious schemes to improve living standards among formerly colonized peoples frustrated by a shortage of enterprise and resources, and by population growth rates that they could not handle. Unable to afford the expensive anti-pollution devices that have reduced environmental degradation in wealthier industrialized countries, many developing countries have experienced an alarming fouling of their air, water, and soil since they had gained independence. In the early decades of independence, the very existence of the nation-states that were carved out of the Western colonial empires was often challenged by the internal rivalries, and in some cases, civil wars between different social and ethnic groups. Economic growth was hampered by unprecedented rates of population increase. The structure of the international market and the underdeveloped state of most colonial economies at the time of independence. Some social groups benefited more than others from the opportunities created by independence, and women continue to find themselves disadvantaged in nearly all areas of their lives. The very active part women played in many nationalist struggles was probably even more critical to their earning the right to vote and run for political office. Women's activism also produced some balance of equality and equal rights, education, and occupational opportunities under the laws of many new nations. However, the equality that was proclaimed on paper often bore little resemblance to actual rights that most women could exercise. It also had little bearing on the conditions under which they lived their daily lives. Even the rise to power of individual women such as Indira Gandhi, who was India's Prime Minister, proved to be one of the most resolute and powerful of all third world countries. Or Corazon Aquino, President of the Philippines in the post-Marcos era of the late 1980s, is deceptive. In most instances, female heads of state in the emerging nations entered politics and initially won political support because they were connected to powerful men. Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, and Corazon Aquino's husband was the martyred leader of the Filipino opposition to Ferdinand Marcos. Benazir Bhutto, a prime minister of Pakistan, was the daughter of a domineering Pakistani prime minister who had been toppled by a military coup and executed in the late 1970s. Path to economic growth and social justice. However, much of the leaders of the new nations of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia might have blamed their society's woes on the recently departed colonizers. They soon felt the need to deliver on the promises of social reform and economic well-being that had done so much to rally support to the nationalist cause. Different leaders adopted different approaches, and some tried one strategy after another. Although it is obviously impossible to deal with all these efforts at nation building and economic development in depth, the basic elements of several distinctive strategies are considered in this chapter. The discussion of each strategy focuses on a single prominent case example. Charismatic populists and one-party rule. One of the least successful responses on the part of leaders who found their dreams for national renewal frustrated has been a retreat into authoritarian rule. This approach has often been disguised by calculated charismatic appeals for support from the disfranchised masses. Military responses, dictatorships, and revolutions. Given the difficulties that leaders such as Nkrumah face after independence and the advantages the military have in crisis situations, the proliferation of coups in the emerging nations is not surprising. Armed forces have at times been divided by the religious and ethnic rivalries that have been so disruptive in new nations, but the regimentation and emphasis on discipline and in-group solidarity in military training often renders soldiers more resistant than other social groups to these forces. The Free Officers Movement evolved from a secret organization established in the Egyptian army in the 1930s, founded by the idealistic young officers of the Egyptian rather than Turco-Egyptian descent. The Secret Revolutionary Command Council studied conditions in the country and prepared to seize power in the name of a genuine revolution. For many decades, it was loosely allied to the Muslim Brotherhood, another revolutionary alternative to the Khedive regime. The Indian alternative, development for some of the people. Although the approach to nation building and economic development followed by the leaders of independent India has shared the Nazarite emphasis on socialism and state intervention, India's experience has differed from Egypt's in several different ways. To begin with, the Indians have managed to preserve civilized civilian rule throughout the nearly 5 decades since they won their independence from Great Britain. In fact, in India, the military has consistently defended secular democracy against religious extremism and other would-be authoritarian trends. In addition, although India, like Egypt, has been saddled with the crushing burden of overpopulation, it came to independence with a larger industrial and scientific sector, a better communication system and a bureaucratic grid, and a larger and more skilled middle class in proportion to its total population than other emerging nations. Iran, religious revivalism and the rejection of the rest. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In many respects, the Khomeini Revolution of 1979 was a throwback to the religious fervor such as anti-colonial resistance movements as that led by the Mahdi of the Sudan in the 1880s. South Africa, the apartheid state and its demise. South Africa was by no means the only area still under some form of colonial dominance decades after India gained its independence in 1947. Portugal, the oldest and long considered the weakest of the European colonizers, held onto Angola, Mozambique, and its other African possessions until the mid-1970s. Until 1980, Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, was run by white settlers who had unilaterally declared their independence from Great Britain. Southwest Africa became fully free of South African control only in 1989, and some of the smaller islands in the West Indies and the Pacific remained under European or American rule to the present day. Until the late 1980s, the government prohibited all forms of black protest and brutally repressed even non-violent resistance. Black organizations such as the African National Congress were declared illegal, and African leaders such as Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela were shipped off to maximum security prisons. Other leaders such as Steve Biko, one of the young organizers of the Black Consciousness Movement, were murdered while in police custody. Through spies and police informers, the regime tried to capitalize on personal and ethnic divisions within the black majority community. Favoritism was shown to some leaders and groups to keep off from uniting with others in an all-out opposition to apartheid. Comparisons of emerging nations. This chapter has focused on many of the common problems faced by newly independent nations in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa in the first decades of the 20th century. Some of these problems obviously resemble issues in Latin America, discussed in Chapter 33, where new nations' problems were less salient than for those regions discussed here, but where population pressure, environmental change, and considerable economic dependence also loomed large. Despite common issues, it is also important to distinguish particular patterns in the late 20th century, some of which reflected older traditions in key civilizations. India's success in maintaining democracy, for example, contrasts with the experience of most of the Middle East and, until recently, much of Africa. India was less completely a new nation than its counterparts elsewhere. Developments in the Middle East reflected massive changes ranging from the tensions over Israel to the region's growing control over its oil revenues. Despite distinguished traditions, most nations in this region were new, and political patterns also reflected the absence of the dominant regional state since the fall of the Ottoman Empire.